The subcommittee will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recesses of the subcommittee at any time. We welcome everyone to this morning's hearing on the Reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act. I will now recognize myself for an opening statement. I'm pleased that the Subcommittee on Crime, Terrorism, and Homeland Security is holding our first hearing of this 116th Congress about our critical duty to reauthorize the Violence Against Women Act. This law has been successful at attempting to change policies that have led to injustices and too often indifference to victimization and suffering throughout our country's history. It is important to review how we arrived at this moment. This month has a special significance that is relevant to this hearing because it is celebrated as the Women's History Month. In 1980, President Jimmy Carter first designated March 2nd through the 8th as Women's History Week. 7 years later, in 1987, Congress passed Public Law 100-9, designating March as Women's History Month. 7 years after that, in 1994, Congress passed Public Law 103-322, the Violence Against Women's Act of 1994, which we call VAWA, a landmark piece of legislation which began with bipartisan support in both the House and in the Senate. This year, we celebrate the 25th anniversary of VAWA, since President Bill Clinton signed the first VAWA into law on September 13, 1994. On this day, March 7th, President Barack Obama signed our last VAWA in 2013. And today, on the 6th anniversary of VAWA's last passage, we are holding this hearing to address the urgency of now in reauthorizing this vital legislation, which addresses the needs of all victims and survivors of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, and stalking. As a result of this historic legislation, which has unarguably proven critical in the lives of so many survivors, every state has enacted laws making stalking a crime and strengthened their criminal rape statutes. While this legislation is named the Violence Against Women Act, this is gender-neutral legislation, which responds to the needs and care of all survivors, men, women, and children alike. For centuries, women have fought vigorously to demand changes in our federal law, not simply for their own benefit, but for others as well. Because they sought progress, VAWA is no exception in that regard. As Shirley Chisholm once said, you don't make progress by standing on the sidelines, whimpering and complaining. You make progress by implementing ideas. We have made progress in VAWA 2000, 2005, and 2013, but the statistics remain alarming and unacceptable. Domestic violence claims at least 2,000 lives each year. 70% of the victims are women. Most intimate partner homicides in which a person targets a spouse, boyfriend, or girlfriend are committed with firearms. An astounding 17,500 victims disclose the use or threat of firearms being used during abuse. We must hold abusers accountable, provide vital services, and promote safe environments where survivors are protected. The Me Too movement continues to remind us that we can never remain complacent, and instead we must always shed light on the prevalence of violence against women, men, and children. We must not ignore the even greater recognition by our citizens, exemplified by the Me Too movement, that we must insist on taking action now, and we must act to reauthorize and strengthen VAWA so that it meets today's challenges. In the most recent 2018 impact report by the National Domestic Violence Hotline, more than 370,000 total calls were answered. Of that amount, more than 200,000 calls, chats, and texts went unanswered due to the lack of resources. In those contacts made, 83,000 victims reported that their abusive situation involved children. 13,000 victims experienced stalking. Almost 7,500 cited suicidal threats from their abusive partners, while 4,000 cited thoughts of suicide themselves. VAWA provides grants that help break the cycle of domestic violence. These vital resources save lives by assisting women, men, and children as they flee abuse and heal from trauma. The grants also support training for law enforcement, prosecutors, judges, service providers, and communities to provide comprehensive support to victims, hold offenders accountable, and keep our communities safe. Prior to VAWA, law enforcement lacked the resources and tools to respond effectively to domestic violence and sexual assault. Each reauthorization of VAWA has improved protections for women and men while helping to change the culture and reduce the tolerance for domestic violence, sexual assault, dating violence, and stalking. VAWA-funded programs have provided victims with critical services such as transitional housing, legal assistance, and supervised visitation services. VAWA has led to increased reporting of sexual assault and increased ability of victims to flee abuse. It has also helped address the unique barriers faced by rural area, elderly, and disabled victims. Despite these gains, much work remains to be done to address the unmet needs of survivors. We must hold abusers accountable, provide vital services, and promote safe environments where survivors are protected. The Me Too movement continues to remind us that we can never remain complacent, and instead we must always shed light on the prevalence of violence against women, men, and children. We must not ignore the even greater recognition by our citizens, exemplified by the Me Too movement, that we must insist on taking action now, and we must act to reauthorize and strengthen VAWA so that it meets today's challenges. That is why I look forward to hearing from our panel of expert witnesses to help us understand these issues, the successes of VAWA, and the need to do even more to strengthen the law. It is now my pleasure to recognize the ranking member of the subcommittee, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Radcliffe, for his opening statement.
Madam Chair, if I may beg the Chair's indulgence to change the order of opening statements so that the gentleman, the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Collins, can be recognized for his opening statement.
Absolutely.
Thank you, and I appreciate the indulgence, and I'm sure the Chairman, I appreciate that. Chairwoman Bass, I thank you for holding this hearing today and share your belief that the reauthorization of the Violence Against Women's Act is critical, and appreciate the opportunity to hear from our witnesses that are going to be talking about this. The Violence Against Women's Act was first signed into law in 1994 when the domestic violence was largely considered a hidden crime. The law signaled awareness of the need to stop the growing tide of domestic violence and sexual assault. While this law has helped us take great strides in the right direction, unfortunately, domestic violence and sexual assault are still far too prevalent today, and those crimes continue to disproportionately impact women. That's why we need to reauthorize the Violence Against Women Act and make sure it's working and focusing on those it was intended to help. House Republicans tried to reauthorize the VAWA Act through the end of fiscal year, but Democrats blocked that reauthorization. We wanted to ensure that this program remained up and running while discussions continued about ways to improve the current law. We remain willing and ready to work across the aisle and with our Senate partners to reauthorize VAWA. Unfortunately, my understanding is that the Democratic majority intends to introduce their VAWA reauthorization from last Congress, and it's my understanding, I just found out, to actually mark it up next week. This radical legislation stands no chance of becoming law and is merely evidence of the majority's regrettable intent to weaponize this important piece of legislation to score political points. That is fundamentally unfair to women and all who depend on the services these programs provide. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today and working to reauthorize VAWA in a way that reduces violence, protects victims, and ensures that the law works as intended. I would also like to ask unanimous consent to enter into the statements from the Coalition Against Trafficking Women, the National District Attorneys Association, and a letter from a group of survivors lead the organization into the record. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you very much. I'm now pleased to recognize the chairman of the full committee, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Nadler, for his opening statement.
I thank the chair. I thank the Chair for holding this important hearing today and for her leadership in the effort to reauthorize the Violence Against Women Act. I also want to thank Ms. Jackson Lee for her longstanding and tireless efforts over the years to protect and strengthen the Act. This critical statute, which we often refer to as VAWA, was signed into law in 1994 to help ensure that women in America are free from violence and free from fear. At the time VAWA was enacted, it was all too common for violent crimes against women to go without appropriate response and to remain unaddressed by the criminal justice system. Although there is still much to do, VAWA represented a historic shift in the federal role in combating these crimes. Congress began to take seriously its role in ensuring that communities in America have the tools needed to combat the crimes of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, and stalking. Since then, victims, survivors, and the communities where they live have relied on Congress to help provide the resources needed to prevent and investigate these crimes and to assist survivors. And these programs and resources are unfortunately still necessary. Every year, approximately 7.9 million women experience the crimes of rape, physical violence, or stalking by an intimate partner, and an average of 3 women are killed every day by a current or former intimate partner. VAWA, which is not gender exclusive, addresses the needs of men and women, children, persons with disabilities, homeless people, and LGBTQ people, among others. The range of individuals VAWA helps is broad and is as diverse as our communities around the country. Our engagement as a Congress with the issues VAWA addresses has only served to highlight the severity of these problems. VAWA has changed the landscape of how we talk about the issue of violence in the home, in the workplace, and in society at large. More importantly, VAWA has had and continues to have a positive impact on people who rely on its assistance, whether directly or indirectly. Through grants to state and local governments, the Office on Violence Against Women in the Department of Justice funds the work of thousands of advocates in preventing and addressing domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, and stalking, and in assisting and training law enforcement and victim advocates. Grants administered through the Department of Health and Human Services provide funds for shelters, rape prevention and education, programs to address and reduce the sexual abuse of runaways and homeless youth, and community programs to educate the community on domestic violence. The reach of the work carried out under VAWA is vast, and we must continue to support it. The goal of putting an end to domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, and stalking once and for all will only be achievable if we as a Congress are engaged and committed to it. Because of its importance and success, VAWA was reauthorized on a bipartisan basis in 2000, in 2005, and again in 2013. Unfortunately, not only did VAWA expire without being reauthorized, but because of the foolish government shutdown, we even had a lapse in appropriations for VAWA earlier this year, which jeopardized funding for domestic violence shelters. But our task now is not just to reauthorize VAWA, but to enhance and expand it to make it even more effective. I know there are many people here today, including our witnesses and many of our members, who have been working tirelessly to support victims and survivors as they seek to live full lives after suffering traumatic experiences. Often the people who do this type of work are survivors themselves. Thank you for your hard work and for being here. For them and for all of our communities, we must reauthorize and reinforce VAWA now. It is fitting that we discuss this issue during Women's History Month, and I look forward to hearing from our witnesses and working with my colleagues on this important legislation. Thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Now it's my pleasure to recognize the ranking member of the subcommittee, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Radcliffe, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chair. And I do want to thank each of the witnesses for being here today to testify. As a federal prosecutor, I had the privilege for many years of seeing firsthand the profound impact of the Violence Against Women Act. I saw and I learned so much from working with the Department of Justice's Office on Violence Against Women. But for all the women that I know and that I saw VAWA has helped, as a prosecutor, I can't help but think about and remember all of the women who weren't so fortunate. Women whose husbands or boyfriends put them in cemeteries because those husbands or boyfriends drank too much or became jealous too much or because they just like to hit women too much. And because of that, I know what's at stake if we don't reauthorize VAWA. VAWA can and should provide all women a safe harbor who need one. It can and should provide a means for all women to leave abusive relationships. It can and should provide the counseling needed by any woman to survive the abuse and violence they have endured. VAWA can and should facilitate and accelerate the prosecution of sexual assault cases so that women, as they wait for their case to go to trial, don't have to live in fear that they might suffer more abuse or violence. Madam Chair, we owe survivors of domestic violence a bill that doesn't water down these services for women. As with any proposal before Congress, we should be vigilant in conducting oversight to ensure the taxpayer dollars are used effectively. And because the principal objectives for VAWA programs are the mitigation, the reduction, and the prevention of the effects and occurrences of domestic violences, then we should target those objectives. We owe it to survivors and victims of domestic violence an obligation to ensure that we're not duplicating grants that are housed at other various federal agencies. We owe them transparency and accountability and support for rigorous evaluations of existing VAWA programs to make sure that these programs are working as intended for those they are intended to help. These policies should be non-controversial. Who would object to requiring greater accountability and increased prioritization of the processing of untested sexual assault kits? Who would object to providing protection for faith-based providers and religious organizations which work with survivors of domestic violence and human trafficking? If we don't protect faith-based providers and religious organizations from being discriminated against, then we are in fact reducing access for survivors of violence. Madam Chair, as a prosecutor in cases involving violence against women, I never once asked a victim if she was a Republican or a Democrat. I never once asked a rape counselor if he or she was a Republican or a Democrat. I never asked the parents of a victim if they were Republican or Democrat. I never asked because some things are more important than politics, and protecting women who need protection from violence is one of those things. So it is my hope that this body, that this Congress, can agree on a bipartisan and non-controversial reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act. That is my hope. But it is my fear that this committee's majority will instead push forward with a partisan bill that is intended to score political points. That is my fear, because when the current reauthorization expired on February 15th of this year, it did so because Democrats now in the majority of this House refused to include a simple extension for the reauthorization of VAWA until the end of the fiscal year. Last month, Madam Chair, Democrats indicated that they wanted to use VAWA as a political bargaining chip. I applaud my colleague, Congresswoman Lesko, herself a survivor of domestic violence, for her dedicated efforts to enact a clean extension of the existing law, a clean extension that would have ensured that VAWA and the critically important role that it plays would not have lapsed. So as we move forward with today's hearing, I echo her request for members of this committee and of this Congress to come forward in a bipartisan fashion to pass an extension of VAWA instead of trying to score political points against each other. Instead of trying to score political points, for once, it is my hope and it is my plea that maybe this body can speak for all women who need our help to survive the abuse and violence they have suffered, and also to speak for those victims who weren't so fortunate. I yield back.
I will now introduce today's witnesses. The Honorable Ramona A. Gonzalez is the presiding judge of La Crosse County, Wisconsin, and the president-elect of the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges. Judge Gonzalez serves as faculty on the domestic violence issue for the National Judicial Institute on Domestic Violence, and is a past member of the Wisconsin Anti-Human Trafficking Task Force, and is a current member of the Wisconsin Judicial Committee on Child Welfare. Professor Sarah Deer is a professor of women, gender, and sexuality studies in the School of Public Affairs and Administration of the University of Kansas. In 2014, she was named a MacArthur Fellow. She is a member of the Muscogee Creek Nation and is the Chief Justice for the Prairie Island Indian Community Court of Appeals. She has worked to end violence against women for over 25 years, and her scholarship focuses on the intersection between federal Indian law and victim rights. Ms. Julia Beck is a member of the Women's Liberation Front and a former law and policy co-chair of Baltimore City LGBTQ Commission. She represented Women's Liberation Radio News at the 2018 Montreal Massacre Memorial, organized by the Vancouver Rape Relief and Women's Shelter. Ms. Rob Valente is a policy consultant for the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence, a member organization of the National Task Force to End Sexual and Domestic Violence. She has worked on each authorization and reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act. Ms. Valente also served as attorney advisor to the Office on Violence Against Women of the U.S. Department of Justice and was the founding director of the American Bar Association Commission on Domestic and Sexual Violence. We welcome all of our distinguished witnesses and thank them for participating in today's hearing. Now, if you would please rise, I will begin by swearing you in. Raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you are about to give is true and correct to the best of your knowledge, information, and belief, so help you God? Thank you. Let the record show the witnesses answered in the affirmative. Thank you, and please be seated. Please note that each of your written statements will be entered into the record in its entirety. Accordingly, I ask that you summarize your testimony in 5 minutes. I'll help you stay on time by using the timing light on your table. When the light switches from green to yellow, you have 1 minute to conclude your testimony. When the light turns red, it signals your 5 minutes have expired, and I will make sure you know that. Ms. Gonzalez, you may begin. And yes, right ahead.